and welcome everybody on what I hope is for you a really sunny, lovely day. And actually, the weather that we're having is really one of the typical examples why we're talking about this subject. I'm from Germany. This hot weather, I love this hot weather, and I thrive in it. When I talk to some of my British colleagues, they're like, "It's so hot, I can't function," and I think that's already a typical example of what we're going to talk about today, isn't it? Which is the sensory learning impact of the children in our classrooms and how we can support that. So just a quick background to me, as I was introduced, I'm an occupational therapist for the Witherslack group. Have been for Witherslack for about 2 years, but as you probably can tell on my grey hair, I've been an OT for much longer than that. I've been in the paediatric setting for over 20 years now. So I'm really hoping to share some of my knowledge and my learning along the way with you today, and provide you with some typical ideas that we sort of give out as OTs, and hopefully they'll be practical enough for you to take away and get started in your settings. So let's have a quick look what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at recapping on senses. Quite a lot of you will know our basic senses, but it's always good to recap. Understand the link between our sensory preferences and how we learn. And as well, how to apply the knowledge in the classroom, because that's always what we want, isn't it? Well, you're telling me all this theory, but how do I do this now in my day-to-day practice? So we're looking, as said, with the agenda at the senses. We're looking at sensory preferences and how they impact our learning, and talking about the strategies. And afterwards, there will be time for questions. More than happy to ask you all the questions. We might not get through everyone's questions. I don't know how many of people are joining us today, but we certainly aim to answer as many questions as you may have. Right, so let's looking at the senses. There might be some that I really think I know about that one. So obviously we've got our vision, we've got our hearing, we've got our touch, we've got our smell, and we've got our taste. Now the three that becoming more known to everyone, but some people are not sure about our vestibular, so our balance and movement, and you think, how does that impact on us when we're sitting on a chair? So we'll go into that a little bit. Our proprioception is basically our body awareness within space. If I'm not quite sure if my feet are planted on the floor, then when I'm walking, it feels like walking on cotton wool or walking on air, and it feels quite unsettling. And for us, so those of us who haven't got those experience, it's quite an alien thought, but quite a lot of our children really struggle with understanding where their body is in space. And obviously, if you have to focus on where our body is in space, that takes our mind away from other things, such as the learning that you would like to teach the children and like to take in. And then one of the more newer topics is interoception. Again, it's something that as functioning human beings we often take for granted, but we actually help our young children to learn it. So we know that when a baby cries, we try different things. We either feed them, or we get them to sleep, or we get them dummy. And over time, we name that with the children. I think you're really narky right now because you're hungry. And this is how we then develop that actually, oh, that rumbling in my tummy, that means I'm hungry. Some of our children, as we know, that are neurodivergent or that struggle with sensory difficulties, don't make sense of what their body's telling them. So they don't understand that if they don't have enough sleep, that impacts their concentration and they feel really narky. They don't understand that their sugar levels go low when they're feeling really hungry and not eating. And I think we're more and more learning that we need to pay more emphasis to that, because those things are not as automatic as we sometimes think. And I said, especially with our neurodivergent population, our children that are struggling in the classroom, it's really one thing to look out for, to look at their interoception. So, you know, one of Montessori is probably for you as educators a name that's still quite familiar, and I think she was a big driver, which is why I picked one of her quotes. So she says, our senses are the big explorers of the world, and they open the way to our knowledge. Our apparatus for educating the senses offer the child a key to guide his exploration of the world. So basically what that's saying is we need our senses to make sense of the world around us, and therefore we use our senses to build our memories, to build our learning, and therefore it's really important that we take that into account when we understand how children learn and how our senses impact positive and negatively on our learning. And then I think the other one that we often, I think, gets more and more, especially when you head towards secondary school, I would say, is that we're missing that hands-on learning styles. I think it's coming more and more back in. But I think being creative and feeling and hearing and smelling, etc., really impacts on our learning and how much we take. The more senses we can stimulate while we're trying to learn, the more our brain will get that information, and the more there will be long-term effects of learning. So I think, again, that's quite important. So if we then look, if we then look at all the sensory consideration that we're going in the classroom, a lot of people think, oh, you're an OT, you just mainly look at the sensory processing difficulties. But I think it's really important to take into account as well our different learning styles. We all learn differently, and we go into the different learning styles in a minute. But it's really important for you to understand how a child learns in order for you to adapt your learning resources in line with what the child needs. And actually sometimes to do a quick sweep through your class and saying, do you actually have to have more visual learners? Do you have more auditory learning? What is it? Might be a really good way for you to direct how you prepare your lessons, because you might actually capture a bigger audience and therefore achieve more learning in your classroom without having to individualize too many of your areas. Arousal levels. Again, we talk about arousal levels in more detail. How our concentration, how arousal levels fit together, and how that impacts how much information we can take into. And then obviously sensory processing difficulties. If your senses are distorted, if there is something triggering you and a negative response in you, that will obviously impact on our learning. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well in a minute. So let's look at the learning styles. If you type in learning styles on the internet, there's always a huge array of choices that you have. And I think the most known ones, I took the models that actually makes probably most sense to people, is so we've got our visual learning, we've got our oral learning, so auditory learners as well, they're called, children that prefer more to read and write. We've got our more practical learners, so the kinesthetics learners, and we have the multimodal, so the ones that encompass more than one of the senses. So if we look at the visual, and I'm sure I've got many experienced learners in the teachers in the audience right now that will tell you, the importance of all of that. And a lot of the strategies that I will mention will be familiar to you already, but I'm hoping it gives you a good idea. So when you have visual learners, what is important is to include a lot of visual stimulation into your learning. So graphics, cartoons, illustration. There can be visuals that you make, or there can be visuals that you make together with the child. Use flashcards to review course materials. Again, it's that sort of feedback of visual rather than having everything, auditory. Use flowcharts and maps to organize materials. Again, I know that you using a lot of thought maps, etc. when you're writing stories, all of that will help a young person. And it doesn't always have to be, words, it can be pictures, just so that it sits with a child a little bit better. And I don't know, some of you might have heard of Temple Grandin. She's a huge visual thinker, and therefore her imagination of seeing things visually is huge. But therefore, she also categorizes in vision. So when you say to her, can you draw a church? She will ask you, well, what type of church? Would you like me to draw a Catholic church? Because Methodist churches often look a little bit different. Do you want me to draw a church from America? Or do you want me to draw a church maybe from mainland Europe? So it's again, it's that sort of, what is the child seeing when you give them that information? And therefore, you need to know that in order for you to understand the learning that they've taken in. Highlight and color codes for different things. Again, that's really quite positive, especially for your sort of ADHD children as well, that often skip over things. if you have different colours in there, it helps them to visually focus on the differences, and therefore keeps them a little bit more focused. Also then to teach children, especially in secondary school, when they have to learn to revise a little bit more, to do that themselves, to highlight the important parts, because sometimes, visual information, whole text of reading can be really overwhelming. So if you highlight yourself the most important bits, it draws you visually to those areas, and therefore you memorize them a bit more. Similar to color-coded tables and compare and contrast elements. Use a whiteboard to explain important information. Don't just give the information verbally. So even when you, for example, ask the children to do a task, rather than giving them the 3 steps that they have to do, write it down. Once it's written down, it's a lot more stable. And even those who are not visual learners, but maybe have memory difficulties, they can then go back to that visual reminder and can learn better from that. Have children play around with different font styles and sizes that actually improve the readability. We know, for example, with children with dyslexia or dyslexic tendencies, that can be really, really important, that different styles can really help them read things a little bit better. So then just let that sink in for a moment, because we're now going to come to the auditory learners. Similar sort of styles. So they're talking more. They're the sort of, I would say, the verbal processors. For them, it's really important to maybe go over what they've learned verbally, just so that they can vocalize it and therefore memorize it again, because they're hearing their own version, their own interpretation of what they've heard. Ask your students questions after the lesson and see how they answer you through the spoken word then, rather than visuals. I think, again, like I said before, it's really helpful for them to talk things through. Have them record lectures and review them with you. I know that some schools are quite big in recording their lessons now, that the children can go onto whichever portal the school uses and come back to that lesson. I think, again, that's really quite important, especially, for example, if a child has got concentration difficulties and is an auditory learner. It really helps them to then recap, because they might have just missed parts of what you've said. As you teach, explain your methods and send questions and answers, so that involve the children in, how do we think we should do that? Get their vision, get their understanding of what they heard, and they voice their ideas. Ask for oral summary if you're not sure if the child understood or heard what you said. Create an audio file that the students can listen to, similar to the recording of the lesson. Or, as I said, create a video of this session. YouTube videos give the children more things that they can listen to. Podcasts are really, really popular, and there's a huge range of topics, all sorts of topics, and all sorts of age ranges out on podcasts now, which is fantastic. And organise a live Q&A sessions, really, so that they can verbally process again what they've seen and heard from your lesson. So I know that's been already quite a whiz through 2 slides. So the reading and writing. So for some students, it's good to have a summary so about the lesson. So again, you can either have that just written, or they can make themselves notes. They're also the children that learn better when they make themselves notes as they go along. Assign them stories and essays, or give them a written task to do rather than a feedback session. Allow them to make lists of important parts of the lessons, like I said, or make notes. Provide downloadable notes as well, and checklists, so that they know what they can do. Encourage the extra reading by giving them, rather than giving them a podcast, for example, give them different blogs or a different website or a newspaper to read around the area that you're talking about. And some of them also, because writing, and people forget that, is a physical motor task as well, is use that. So give them, if you want them to listen, sometimes it's quite good for them to have something to fiddle with, which the writing would then, it replaces the writing in that moment in time, because you can't always allow them to write. Sometimes you just want them to participate, maybe in a discussion, etc., but allow them then to have something to fiddle with, because some of it is the motor element of it as well. Sorry, I'm just taking a quick swig of water. So, and then kinesthetic learners, this is very much how I learn. It's a very practical approach to learning. And I think, again, if you think of your primary school age, you now have your number blocks where the children can see and physically build what 3 and 4 blocks together make, rather than having to have that quite abstract concept in their heads. So give them different sizes of pencil and pens and crayons to jot down, because again, the feedback you get from different materials are very different and how the children perceive it. If you teach a language, look at daily conversation, make it practical with them. Again, I know for my children's teachers, they now set on a cafe, and the children in French had to ask for their own croissant from some of the older students, to just learn that in daily conversation what it means. Because if you just learn vocabulary in an abstract concept, it doesn't mean that much to them. Dramatize and act out lessons is a really good way of doing it to understand better. So designing and building a bridge, for example, from Forest School. I visited a school not long ago, and it was amazing. They really did a bridge, and they did from the concept of drawing the bridge, looking at the physics behind, a bow bridge versus a straight bridge on strings. And sorry, I don't know what all the bridges are called, suspension bridges and that sort of thing. And then they decided on design, and they actually built it, and they now have a bridge that they can walk over. But all of that, the practical building, was actually for some of them to really understand the concepts of the physics of what they've done initially. And then we've got obviously the multisensory approaches to different things. So some of the teachers that have been with us for a while might still remember the multisensory approach to handwriting, where you cut out sandpaper letters or string letters, and the children had to, close their eyes and identify the letters, or where you written letters on their backs and they had to identify which letter is that one. Because again, that multisensory approach then touches on different senses, and the more information, like I said in the beginning, go to the brain from the different senses, the larger parts of brains will be stimulated, and therefore the higher the chance of the children memorizing it. Right, so now we would come to the next part. If you remember, we're looking at 3 parts today. We just talked about the learning styles. We're now talking about arousal levels. And I apologize for those who are maybe more visual learners if I'm quite a fast talker, but I'm just trying to get through a lot of things for you at the moment. And like we said before, you will have the handouts as well. So arousal levels, what do we mean by arousal levels? It's basically the physiological and psychological state of being alert activated. We all need a level of alertness in order to be ready to learn and to experience. So if you're like me at the moment, and I'm not an early riser, when I wake up in the mornings, I'm still pretty knackered. I don't know whether that comes from me as a nature or if that's being a parent, I don't know. But so I do things then, like I need a shower and I need my coffee, and then I know my brain just feels ready to take on the world. So that's what we mean by arousal levels. So it's so fascinating, because it really, our arousal levels fluctuate through the day, but it really affects the ability of our performance. Our arousal level is not right, we cannot concentrate. It means that our brain is not ready to function. So it's being awake, and there's a difference between awake and alert. Okay, so a child that comes in and I didn't have a very good night's sleep, is still very tired, maybe is really stressed by the transition from home to school, their arousal levels will be all over the place. So they're not ready to have the right arousal level to be able to sit on the chair and listen to the instructions. So when the child is at the optimum level of arousal, then they're being alert and focused, and that's when they're right to do learning. And I think this is why it's really important to understand the concept of that one, because if you feel the child is not there, then it's better to focus on getting their arousal levels right than to try and make them sit down and learn, because the outcome will be that they don't learn. And I've now coming to a couple of strategies that will look into. There's certain strategies that we can use to alert, and there's certain strategies that we can use to calm. So let's have a look at that one. So calming sensory input, and these are generalized. Obviously, every child is individualized, but these are just things that as OTs we give out when we're looking, when your child comes in and they're really stressed because of the transition, for example, between home and school, or they had a really bad fallout, or they've just come in like a whirlwind. Again, our sort of ADHD population, you might notice that they come in from the playground. They have their hats full from all the football that just went on, what went on, that they scored a goal, that things were properly unfair. They might have had a squabble in the playground, and you can just tell they're up there, they're up in the sky, they're all over the place. So some of those strategies might help you transition then between the playground and them sitting down. So if you use our vestibular sense, slow rhythmic movement, you will go back to maybe a small baby. What do we do with a baby? We rock them, don't we? When we want to calm them, we sit in a rocking chair, have them in our arms and swing. You always see parents tracing around, jiggling the baby. It's really one of our big calming senses that we have from a very, very early on. Now, I know you don't have a rocking chair necessarily in the school, but you might have a therapy ball, but it's important that they don't bounce about and just get even more hyper. You really help them maybe with some calm music, just roll from side to side while they're sitting on it, or they're just lying on it, and you slowly rock them from side to side. You could have, just sit with them and just sway to some music. But yeah, so rocking in a chair can be really, really helpful, or that vestibular motion, that rocking can be really soothing. From a tactile sense, deep, firm pressure. Now, I'm really, really big promoter for deep pressure. I use it a lot in our centre here, and the children even come and ask, now, Bridget, can I have 5 minutes? Can you just squeeze me, please? Because they really, really feel the benefit from that. And again, that goes really quite back to early experiences of being compressed in the womb. But also, if you think the swaddling is still really, really positive when we're trying to get babies to sleep. And it really comes to that, our joint compression. So it not just uses the tactile sense, but also the proprioceptive sense. It gives the children where they are in space. It gives them a sense of calmness. It gives them a sense of being with the body, and when we feel secure in our body, then we can get ready to learning. Visual, so bring the lighting down. I know for a fact that most of the lighting in most of the school is horrible, bright light that even as teachers or staff find really, really irritating, really. So try maybe take the child to a room where it's a bit softer and where you can provide softer lighting. I know quite a lot of schools now have got rooms, breakout rooms, calming room, sense room, whatever they want to call it, where you can change the light a little bit. I'm a big promoter as well for schools to have adjustable lightings in their classroom, because sometimes you need the children to be more alert, so you need it brighter, and there's other times when you actually need it a bit more calmer. You can have sort of toys for the smaller children with sort of rhythmic lighting in it, and try and reduce the clutter as well. If you get overstimulated by visual input, it can really not be positive for your arousal level. So really try and reduce clutter. Soft, comforting smells. I again work quite a lot with youngsters, and what I often use is a tennis wristband, where the children, I figure out with them what sort of smells they like, and I try and use sort of the calming senses like lavender and things like that. And they can just put some essential oil then on those wristbands and can smell it, and that can be really calming. Again, you would do quite a lot of it for babies, when you give them a bath at night and you use a cream with some lavender on it. Again, we know that is quite calming. So you're trying to replicate that now with your older children, and some of those strategies are just easy to do. Use a quiet, calm voice. I think sometimes we do forget that if our arousal level's higher because we just come from a stressful meeting, we know we're already 5 minutes late for that lesson, etc. So we might talk a little bit fast and all that sort of thing, can have an impact on the arousal levels of our children. And that's absolutely normal and it's nothing to be worried about. But when you become more conscious and you use it more purposeful, your own voice, the impact of it is really, really quite interesting. So again, in your lessons, if you want to, bring the children up, use your high and your energetic voice, and when you want the children to calm down a little bit, be that calm yourself, and you will see that the children will start co-regulating. Sometimes what we say, pick the children up where they are and say, oh, I can really hear that break was really exciting, isn't it? So let's just calm down, and I think we need to prepare now for the lesson, because the lesson that we can now go into is your math. And can you see how I adjust my rhythm? So pick the children up where they are and then adjust your voice to that, and you will see how much the children will follow. And then chewy foods, something that makes you chew really, really hard. And again, I use that quite a lot in transition between break time and going into lessons. It's really, really helpful in terms of really giving that deep pressure through your jaw, and it can be really calming. So cereal bars, really strong cereal bars, etc., can be really positive for that. Alerting sensory input. So again, we're looking at the different senses. So fast and unpredictable movements are the opposite of what we said. Really jumping about, they're the children who come in and you just feel they're so flat. Just run, swing, anything fast movement that you can build in will be helpful with that. From a tactile point of view, use vibration. You get so many little mini vibration toys now that are really useful in the classroom, and the children just sit there maybe holding onto their hand. Cold water from a spray, cold drinks, all of those. Tickling, light touch. I know tickling is a bit difficult in the classroom, but maybe have a little bit of play fight, or something that really brings them up. Messy play can be really alerting as well, depending on the materials that you're using. Visual bright lights can be really interesting. If you flicker a light, or if you have a light toy, again, depending on the ability of the child, can really bring arousal levels up. Strong and pungent smells. So sometimes I do sort of blind tasting and smelling, and it's really interesting how the children perceive that. But if you certainly smell on horseradish, or something vinegary or something like that, the children go, oh my God, what's that? And it can be a really fun way of actually bringing arousal levels up. Loud and fast music. Again, if you're a parent and you're trying your arousal levels of your child is really, really slow in the morning, to just start with a loud music with fast beats can really help the child then to gauge into stressing activity and whatever that they need in order to get their arousal levels up to where they need to be ready for school. Again, crunchy foods and cold drinks and sour and salty. So really something more strong flavored, strong in their approach will, provide more higher levels of sensory input to your child's nervous system, and therefore will bring the alerting senses up, and the child will be higher on their arousal levels. Right, so you'd be pleased to hear you're already halfway, at least through the presentation, because we're coming to our third one now, which is probably where you see sometimes the OTs coming in more when we talk about sensory processing difficulties and preferences. And they're very much linked as well to the other two topics that we already talked about. When we talk about little sensory processing, I often like to think in the area of the little cup and the big cup. So there's children who are really, really sensitive to certain areas of sensory input, so they don't need much to get their cup to overflow. So they're the ones who like the ear defenders because noise levels are really strong. They're the picky eaters because they're finding sort of oral stimulation really quite difficult. They're the ones who may be hiding in the corner because the whole hustle and bustle of the school is just too much, and they can't cope with that one. So they can then either really act out in that one because it's too much and present with your sort of behavioural difficulties, or they're the ones who really hide and shut down and saying everything's just too much for me. With the big cup, it's the other way around. They're the ones when they fall over and have a bleeding knee where you think, oh my God, that must have hurt. And they're like, what do you mean? I've hurt myself? Not sure. They need a lot of sensory input for their nervous system to register that actually something's happened. They're the ones who often fidget in the chair because their proprioception, they need a lot more input to actually register where they're sitting down and where they're at in space. They're the ones who just wear often really heavy coats because otherwise they don't feel it. So they're the ones who really need a lot of sensory input for them to register that actually something's happening. So we're going to have a look at that one in a little bit more detail and strategies that you can do. Okay, what do I do when someone's got auditory-wise a really little cup? So let's look at vision first. So if you look at the little cup of the vision, so there again, they're the ones where they're quite quickly visually overstimulated. They don't like bright, noisy, bright light, etc. So really just consider the not sitting them near a bright window or near an open window even. The distraction of even a, for example, tree going in the wind and casting all that shadows on their desk might just be too much. It's something that we wouldn't necessarily notice, but for a child that visually gets quite quickly overstimulated can be too much. So really think about where might they sit best in the classroom so that they're not visually distracted. Minimize visual information at once. Have a look whether auditory they would be better, but visual information can be quite stimulating. And I think a lot of you will probably know that we talk about now calming colours in the classroom with your working walls where you only have information on there that's absolutely necessary, because those children will often blend out visual information because it's just too much for them. Similar when you do your worksheets, really just make sure that there's the information on there that the child needs so that they're not getting sidetracked by maybe all the colourful pictures that you put around it. Sunglasses, and some of you will remember some of them, the children have tinted glasses now, especially our population again with dyslexia really find coloured overlays, coloured glasses in their glasses really helpful because it helps them making sense of the visual information that they're taking on. Hats and umbrellas in bright sunlight when they're out and about. I have a graded approach as well. So what I mean by that is if you remember sitting in a really darkened room and then straight away stepping out in the sunlight, even for people without visual difficulties, that can be just, or you blink in that moment, you feel like, oh, that's hard. Or if someone while you're sitting watched a film in the cinema and the light comes on really bright and they, oh yeah, you know, do a gradual approach. See if when you have a child in a darkened room, maybe open the blinds a little bit first and then open up. So again, if we've got parents in the room, it might be helpful to have blinds, you know, slatted blinds, where you can gradually increase the light in your child's bedroom rather than going from 1 to 0, because that can be really distressing to them. And provide stimulating toys that move and have lights just for them to get used to it. We live in a world where you have to step out in the sunlight. We have to live in a world where, you know, we can't change all the sensory influences. So it's also helping them to prepare and cope with what they're feeling and naming it. So therefore, you know, giving them the exposure to that is still very important. So looking at the children with a big cup then, so again, the ones that need lots of those, really ensure a bright work area, table lamps, have flashing lights, using colour to highlight important information on the pages. So use everything, a bit like we talked about the visual learners, really do everything from a visual point of view and really allow them to get a lot of visual stimulation so that their brain actually is able to notice that information and then interpret it in the right way. So let's look, smell and taste in the little cup. Again, that's an area, especially for our neurodivergent population, quite a big area often. So they're the ones who, they're the picky eater, they hate different tastes and smells, etc. Always use a gradual approach. Offering control and limited choices, allow them to make a choice and make the choices little. So for example, the example I often give, if you want to branch out on them experience different foods, use the crisps, for example, that he likes. Let me say it's a Walker's salt and vinegar crisps, okay? Use maybe one of the normal Walkers to the rich cut ones, and just maybe either taste the texture or the flavor. So give them choices in that one, but make it limited change so that they cope with that change. Healthy eating education can sometimes really work. You know, if you say you're only eating chicken nuggets at the moment, and that works with the more cognitively able children, these are the different food groups. Let's have a look which food groups you're not having. Can we overcome? Can you maybe just try, etc.? And that works with certainly with the more cognitively able children. Allow them to look, smell, and taste different foods. That's where the messy food play often comes in. Before we ask them to put something in their mouth. Our mouth is still quite a protective area, so you might need to allow them to use other senses to explore the food first before we go to the final eating stage. Offering opportunities without expectations. So when you're in on a dinner table or whatever, put the foods in the middle, allow them to really see what you're having, even though if they don't want it, maybe even if they can tolerate it, have a little bit on their plate, but without the expectation necessarily that they have to have it. Joint food preparation is a really positive one. Messy play with food, like I said already before, is a really, really positive one too, without any pressure for the children to allow to go there. The one with a big cup, you know, the ones that you really need a lot of input, give them the ability to serve themselves during meal times. I know with those children sometimes weight can be an issue, but we can talk about that in a minute. Modeling. So again, if they're helping themselves too much, maybe model. So this is maybe a good size portion. Good eating habits, positive response to eating food and giving them healthy choices. Adding a lot of flavors to food, because sometimes it is that the children, again, it just doesn't register via their taste buds that they have eaten. So adding a lot of herbs, spices, etc. into that one is a positive one. And use sensory boxes, give the children different smells throughout the day. I know some classes even use lavender or rosemary or other herbs in their classroom as well to help with that. Scented pencils, pens and paper, store food products out of reach, and find real food with similar textures to non-food items that they choose. So it can go both ways. If the child is constantly overeating and you wouldn't give them an opportunity to use their oral need without putting more weight on, then obviously non-textured, non-food textures can help, like chewy toys, and vice versa. If you want to make it more socially acceptable, sometimes giving them a really strong cereal bar and then moving them away from their chewy toy can also be an option. And use a chewy toy, like I said. And again, like I said, the sweatband with strong smells can really help with that as well. So let's go to the auditory sense, so the little cup. Using their own music and headphones as a distraction can be really helpful. I know in the classroom that's not always possible, but maybe in break times they can have that to just allow them to calm their senses down. Ear defenders or earplugs. Now, I'm really, really cautious on that front. There's a lot of evidence there. If the ear defenders or earplugs are overused, it can actually increase sensitivity. A bit like I said, you know, when you go from a darkened room straight into bright sunlight, if we're always blocking out noise that we don't like, then we're not desensitizing towards it. So for me, ear defenders and earplugs really, really need to be used in really concrete times and with a clear reasoning as to why they're being worn. Prepare them when they expect loud noises. You know, say to them, right, today we're going to have a fire alarm. Today we're going to go on a trip. And that road is really, really busy. There's a lot of lorries on there. Just stay with me. Give them calming strategies to cope with that one. Control. Give them ability to control some of the situation. So, for example, it would be really great if you can join the assembly for 5 minutes, but if you have to leave, because today we're having a lot of musicians, after that 5 minutes when we talked about an important topic, then you can leave that. And over time, the child will know that there's a beginning and an end, that they have a bit of control, which can help with emotional regulation around their sensory processing difficulties. Gradual approach to introducing sounds. So sometimes people make recordings of, for example, the hair dryers and slowly expose it to them, and the child can play around with their own levels of noise that they want on the recorder that you're using. And really knowing the boundaries when they can and cannot be noisy as well, because they're often the ones that use noise themselves. Right, so the big cups then. Allow noisy times, really allow them to immerse themselves in music and noise, etc., wherever you can. Get them to learn a musical instrument. Again, it gives them control over the loud noises and the type of noise and music that they're making. Listening to their own music on headphones, again, like we discussed before. And give them a distraction and change from an activity. So refocus often can help with their motivation levels as well. Then we'll look at touch. So we're looking at the little cup, so the quick overflowers. Adjust closing. I put one of the for Marks and Spencer's. They're actually have done a lot of research and have adjusted their clothing quite a lot with regards to that one. Cut out labels. Gradually desensitize as well again, so through messy plays, etc., so that they feel what it's like to maybe have scratchy materials on their hands and their skin. So sandpaper, all that sort of thing, and always move from dry materials to wet ones. Allow them to use tools instead of hands. If the real purpose is to get the task done rather than exposing them, then maybe allow them to use tools on that moment in time. Give them enough preparation time. Explain to them what they might expect, and like beforehand, maybe give them, let's just give it a go for 2 minutes. If you don't like it, then I will wash it off your hands. We're not using that material again, etc. Pre-warning that if you're going to touch them as well is really quite helpful. Physical preparation of the nervous system, we mean with that, with really heavy work activities, so pushing, pulling, carrying heavy bags, etc., can be really helpful to reduce tactile hypersensitivity. Give them a motivator. If you can really do this for 2 minutes, how about I spend some time with you afterwards and we just have one-to-one time? It doesn't have to motivate. It doesn't always have to be food or a monetary motivator. Give them control and choice in that one. Allow them to explain to you what it is exactly about that different material, that touch that they don't like, because you might be able to just make small tweaks in order to change that. And also give distraction. Sometimes we know that ourselves, that if we get distracted from something that we feel really uncomfortable, we can cope with it much longer. So try and see, when you know you're coming up to a situation where the child, maybe sensory system might take over a little bit, really plan that distraction away from it and see if that has any effect. Now we're looking at the big cup. So the countdown timeframes is really a positive one. Fidget box, opportunities that really provide a lot of tactile exploration and deep pressure. Bear hugs, I love a bear hug, or a massage, deep pressure massage. Again, I use that here quite a lot. And build positive touch into your routine, expose them more purposefully, look at their timetable and see when you can build that in regularly. The use of weighted blankets and weighted garments, really look at the safety guidelines, because you shouldn't use them overnight. You only should use them under supervision, and there's a weight limit on it. So weighted must not be more than 10% of a child's body weight. And the other thing we know is about things like weighted, it only works in the moment. There is no carryover. So if a child wears a weighted vest, for example, and you take it off, the child might have a carryover for maybe an hour or so, but after that, that wears off. So it's just being mindful of that one, but also the body can habituate to it. If you wear it too much, then the child starts getting used to it and you won't use it much. So again, use it intermittently and see what the results from that are. And obviously make sure that there's no restricted breathing underneath a weighted blanket. So Movement, again, we're looking at the little cup, the overflowers. Look again, control and choice can really, really be very, very powerful. When the children feel they have a choice in this, their anxiety reduces. And as we know, anxiety produces adrenaline, which heightens our senses. Control and choice can bring a calming element to what you're bringing, which means hopefully you bring the adrenaline down, which means the senses won't be as heightened as they would be if the child feels out of control. Gradual approach to encourage them to be active. Plenty of opportunities without pressure to get used to that one. Breaking tasks down into smaller steps that can be practiced and achieved. So some of us use a certain approach where you really break that down. So when you try and teach a child to skip a rope, for example, what is it of that part that the child can't do? You could lie the rope down on the floor. Can they jump over? Is it the combination of the turning off the rope as well as jumping over? So really break it down and look at what part of that activity the child can't do. Lots of positive rewards of achieving small steps. It really is scary for some of those children to do movement. If your movement and your vestibular system are out of sync, it feels like car sickness, for example, all the time, and it's scary. Or fear of heights. Just stepping from one pebble to another or stepping stone to another can be already really scary for the child. Give them sort of lap blanket, snake or massage, apply deep pressure, again, to bring that calming element down and to increase, for them to feel where their body is in space. The more, as we said before, the more secure we feel in our body, the more we're happy to move with our body into different areas. And encourage the sort of running, jumping and gym to help build up their strength and balance. And sensory ball, therapy ball can be really, really good for that one, because with the therapy ball, you can start off with really gentle movement, go to the bouncing, etc., and build that up gradually. The big cup. Those are your children that are charging through the room and constantly seeking that movement. So obviously build in those movement breaks. Again, movement breaks have been a big heading in a lot of schools. So a lot of schools are using movement breaks quite a lot. Just be mindful then of arousal levels. Yeah, movement breaks can raise the arousal levels. So when a child comes out of that movement break, do something to bring the arousal levels down so that they can be ready and alert for at the right frame of mind to access that learning that you're trying to give them. Sensory circuits, again, that's quite a big phrase that people are using. And if you put in sensory circuits, there's loads of materials on the internet. Deep pressure, weighted rucksacks, move and sit cushion or wobble cushion, they're referred to as well. Jewelry to chew on, more remote activities, and the crunchy and chewy foods and snacks. So interoception. Now with interoception, it's interesting because we don't talk about the little or small big cup, because it's just that lack of awareness. So like I said before, when children are small, we often model that automatically, but keep on modeling that. Keep on saying, I can see you're always flagging maybe after lunchtime. Are you eating enough? Let's explore that, because it could be that your rumbling of your tummy actually means that you're still hungry. Linking language to that experience, like I just explained to you. Helping your child describe what their body is feeling. So really talk through that with them. Helping the child feeling, linking that feeling with the emotion. So, I can see you look really exhausted. Are you actually in the blue zone, for example? Or I can see your face is really crunched up. Do you feel really angry? And really make sense of that. I can feel you're having a real flutter off your heart. Do you feel a bit anxious? All of those wording can be really, really positive. And help your child identify things that may help them. So to co-regulate with them, to that will lead them to self-regulation. How about we both have a drink together now? And then, when you get really hot in the future, just ask for a drink and just build that up gradually. Breathing, mindfulness and relaxation can be really positive. And actions to alleviate that discomfort. Or I can hear that you really got a tummy ache. Shall we, get a hot water bottle for you? Or I can feel, that your arm must be really hurting because that's quite a scrape there, isn't it? Shall we put something cold on there to soothe that? Routines and timers and alarms can be really positive. So there are children out there that really don't feel when they're hungry. So to give them, for example, a smartwatch where they've been reminded to have snacks throughout the day, etc., can be really helpful. sorry, that was just my alarm, so that I know I'm on time. And visuals and videos, again, really helpful. There's a lot of good videos out there for children around interoception. Might just be helpful for your visual learners to not just hear you saying it, but to know that that's out there. So you'd be pleased, we've been through all that. I've bombarded with you with a lot of information. What I would like for you to take away from today is that we're all human beings that perceive our environment with our senses, and that's how we learn. So we perceive our environment, and really what we take in is what goes in our memory, and how well we learn depends on our sensory processes. If we really like to look at something visual, then we will seek out that visual side of things, and this is how we learn. And therefore, for example, an artist might be is obviously a lot more visual, and they will thrive in if you do things in a more visual way. And it doesn't always have to be that you make huge adaptations for every individual learning style. Maybe figure out, have I got more auditory learner, visual learners, or kinesthetic learners in my classroom? And then maybe put them into groups. And rather than giving them all the same task, give them, some of them, the task to maybe give a visual representation of how you want them to solve the problem. Other ones you want them to talk it through and maybe having a debate about it. And the kinesthetic learners, maybe they build something out of Play-Doh around it. So you don't have to do a massive different preparation for it, but you just give them different ways of tackling the problem. And it's really, for me, really to give you the important message of understanding your sensory preferences. Once you get that, it will make your teaching so much easier, because the children will be more engaged and they will take so much more in, which means you don't have to go over it as much, which means you have more success in the children and what they're learning. And that's me done for today. So I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Oh, thank you, Birgit, for presenting another brilliant presentation. We've had a few questions submitted, so we will try to answer as many as we can. Our first question is, do you have any classroom ideas to support a child with difficulty regulating his emotions? He's often dysregulated throughout the day and has extreme reactions towards his peers in the room. Do you have any advice?
Yes, I would go back to deep pressure. So I would see what arousal levels and emotional state that child comes in the mornings. So I would really start early and maybe built in a bit of time out. If you've got a TA available or whatever, it will be so much helpful to get the arousal levels and the emotional state right for the child in that moment in time. So I would maybe, if you've got a sensory room or room available, just do some deep pressure coming in, and then you can also, at the same time, while you're doing the deep pressure, talk with a child through what they can expect, what you would expect from them, again, as well, make the expectations of them really clear. But in order to get their arousal and their emotional state right, I would say use a lot of deep pressure around it, and really help the child with the zones of regulation to help you understand where they're at. Are they in the green zone? Are they in the blue zone? Are they in the red zone, really? So because if you don't get the emotional regulation right, like you quite rightly say, you won't get any learning. So deep pressure. So I often have a mat on the floor, and I really provide them with that deep pressure, or I roll them up a bit, like I said earlier, in the mat, and really give them that time to settle in and understand what is expected of them, and what they would like to expect of you as well.
Oh, thank you, Birgit. That was great. Our next question is, if a child is hyperactive in the class towards the end of the day, suspected ADHD and autism, which would be best, calming or alerting sensory input?
Calming. So if there's ADHD and ASD, my gut feeling is that the child is towards the end completely overstimulated, and it's just about trying to cope. So again, I would try with a lot of calming side of things, not putting too much pressure on the performance, but really looking at where the child's at. I don't know, again, how your child is able to communicate with you in terms of how they're feeling and how they perceive their performance is. So again, building in the zones of regulations, whether that is via pure sensory regulation or if you bring the inside out movies in to really help them what's going on. What might be really helpful for you is as well looking at all the demands of the child throughout the day. And I mean, even the demands that we perceive as normal, and that could be your interoception, recognizing when I'm hungry, etc. Really map out for a week, I would say, that day. When do you really see that onset of that behavior deteriorating? And really look at all the demands that have been leading, or that you've had on that child and that you have to have on that child. I'm not saying that's wrong. But have a look maybe how you maybe then reduce some of those demands on that child throughout the day and see if the child then has more energy and more scope to cope with the end of the day. And the last thing I would look at is this child working himself up, him or herself up towards that transition out of school? So it could already be that you need to look at, okay, do we need to start that transition out, go out of school a bit better and help the child with that transition, because it could be the anxiety that of that transition from school to home, etc., that might trigger some of those behaviours.
Oh, that was great. Thank you. Our next question is, all of these ideas and strategies are amazing and have made us think of techniques for our child. Is this something parents can request skills to incorporate as part of the child's EHCP/reasonable adjustments?
Yeah, EHCP is a really tricky thing. Yes, you can. The answer is yes, you can. You can always build clear strategies into an EHCP. What I find, however, is that children changes and their needs are changing, and the EHCP is not, flexible enough really to allow for those changes to happen. What I would find a lot more beneficial is for you to sit down with your teachers and say, right, at home, we notice when he is really hyper, this is what we find really works. Or when he's really low, this is what we find works. Or these are the sensory things that really impact him. And really have a clear chat with the teachers around it. Because in the HCP, you might have written in there that my child's got sensory processing difficulties in the auditory, strategies need to be there to address it. Because if you do it to the child always needs this and this and this and this and this, in half a year, that might be outdated. So as I said, have it in the HCP that you perceive your child having sensory processing difficulties, but on the day-to-day practical level, sit down with your teacher saying, this works for me at home, but also listen to what works in school. Home and school environments are often very different and the child's react differently. And therefore, it's trial and error. Be open with your teacher. We're not expecting everything to change immediately, but could we try this and seeing what they come back with, and then build those sensory strategy in throughout the day, little and often.
That's great, thank you. We have time for one more question, and I think this question is from a parent. The question is, do you have any advice for a girl with ADHD/ASD who is 8 years old, who will not wear clothes? She will wear one baggy jumpsuit, but this has to be worn to school and at the weekend. It's almost as if her feelings are attached to the clothes and how much she will tolerate this. Do you have any advice on clothing?
Yeah, clothing is a big issue, isn't it, out there, especially with our ASD population. There's a couple of things that I use, which I'm more than happy for you to try. So deep pressure garments. So the feel of different clothing depends on, again, our proprioception and our tactile sense. What I find is that if you use lycra garments, deep pressure garments, and then use that to then lay up on top of that one, you can get them short arm and long arm, but it covers big parts of your body. And then you can lay out on top of that any other clothing that you want to. So, for example, I had a young lad here who was very similar, wouldn't tolerate the school clothing and was very limited in the clothing that we wear. He's now wearing a lycra garment. I think they got it from companies such as Sports Direct. I'm not making advertisement for Sports Direct, but it just comes into my head. Really tight-fitting sort of lycra clothing. That breathable. Sometimes you can get bamboo materials as well because they're a bit more breathable. and use that as your underlayer, because then any texture that you put on top of it will change. That's from a sensory point of view. From a comfort emotional point of view, it's really digging down a little bit deeper what that means for that child. Why do you need that clothing? And can we, and maybe go a little bit more of from a cognitive level, then saying, look, at home, we're really, really happy for you to that clothing. But when we go out into the world, and maybe explain the different roles that we have to have as humans in our world, and therefore it's really important that people, you know, understand what role you're taking now. We can show that by our clothing. That's a sort of from an emotional side of things that I would use it. Coming back from a tactile, again, deep pressure as a preparation before they're put on clothing, and really you can have a nice weekend where you do that. Say, do you know what, we do an experiment this weekend. We brought some clothes that are very similar to the ones that you're wearing, but maybe feeling slightly different. Let's see, after you do deep pressure, if those clothes feel differently. And feel, I often, when I have practical session, I do the hand trick where, you know, when I show you here now, when you scrape your finger like that, it can be, especially with your nail, if you do that for a while, it can be really irritating. I invite you to really do some deep pressure on someone else, and then really knead that hand through, and do that for about a minute, and then do that again afterwards, and see how it different feels. You can really prepare your nervous system for the tactile sense information that it receives, and it can, for some children, really make a difference. And when you've broken that emotional barrier down, that the clothes are not so scary, hopefully that will lead on to more successes further down the line and exploring different clothing.